Sugandha, you can start.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Sugandha Tandon, and I am a research assistant at Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. On behalf of ICS, I welcome you all to our special event titled as The Limits of Tolerance, China's Zero COVID Policy and Societal Response. As we are all aware that unlike the popular opinion, protests are very common in China, at least in the recent decade. And this time, it's said that the protest is the result of a fire outbreak in Urumqi, and it is perceived that it's because of the stringent COVID lockdown procedures that prevented the firefighters from reaching the victims on time. As of now, there are 23 confirmed protests in 17 different Chinese cities, including Beijing, Shanghai, Wuhan, Chengdu, and Guangzhou. We have 3 speakers for today to speak on the topic. Our first speaker is Dr. Jabin T. Jacob, who, I'm really sorry. Our first speaker is Dr. Rityusha Mani Tiwary, who teaches in the Department of Political Science, Shaheed Bhagat Singh College, DU, and is currently an Honorary Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies. Since 2016, she's been the Assistant Editor of China Report. Her current focus of research includes unpacking the interplay of leadership, power, and hegemony in East Asia, and China's role in shaping regionalism in the twin domain of political economy and foreign policy. Our second speaker is Dr. Bhim Subba, who is an assistant professor at the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad, and a visiting associate fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, New Delhi. His research interests are domestic politics and party leadership in China, comparative politics, and international affairs. Our third speaker for today is Dr. Jabin T. Jacob, who is an associate professor at Department of International Relations and Governance Studies at Shiv Nada University. He's also an honorary fellow in ICS and an adjunct research fellow at the National Maritime Foundation. His latest publication include a co-edited volume titled China's Search for National Rejuvenation, Domestic and Foreign Policies under Xi Jinping. For the chair, we have Dr. Usha Chandran, who is an assistant professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University and an adjunct fellow at ICS. Her dominant research interests include gender issues in China with comparison in India, interface between gender and language, women's subjectivity in literature, and exploring sociological methodologies to study the Chinese society. Before I hand over to the chair, I would like to apprise you of a few housekeeping rules. Please keep yourself muted throughout the session. You can post your questions in the chat box, or you can use the raised hand option during the question and answer round. I would hand over to you, ma'am. Over to you.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. This is really the topic today is extremely interesting and much called for us to discuss. As Sugandha just introduced, I think although there were sporadic incidents of protests in the past few months, but as is said, widely, that it was triggered by the fire in Urumqi, where 10 people died and several were injured. The protest, though it started in Urumqi the next day, but it slowly spread throughout China, through especially the major cities. With all these major cities witnessed similar expressions of resistance to zero COVID policy and restrictions of movement. Though at the onset, it seemed to be a spontaneous reaction to the sufferings perhaps the Chinese people have been going through, and we've heard from different channels, those who are friends and colleagues who are in China, we have heard from them that how daily it has been it's a daily suffering, with constant kind of restrictions and checking and so perhaps it could be the reaction. It seemed to be a spontaneous reaction, not a planned one, not a planned protest. It seemed to be a spontaneous reaction to their sufferings. However, what it has done, it has actually raised several questions, for us who are observing China. So protesters who actually mainly seem to be the urban middle class and the students, they were holding white sheets of paper as part of the protest. Now, what does it signify? I mean, there's surely a lot of scope in filling up the pages of these blank pages. So is it only to mourn the deaths in Urumqi, or does it merely represent people's hesitation to fill in those blank sheets because of the censorship? Or does it also, present the plurality of the demands of these protesters and the protests itself? So, as is projected by the Western media, after 3 long years of restrictions in the movement and frequent testing, can these outbursts of protests be seen as a sign of Xi Jinping losing his ground or power? Or is it speculated, or as is speculated, that the CPC itself is losing its ground? However, we all know that the Internationale was sung by the protesters. So these are questions we can look at. And some analysts feel that these protesters are just, they're not very much popular and not it's not so popular that in its scale, I'm saying. So it cannot be long lasting, especially because of the crackdown and the government's decision to gradually pull back this zero COVID policy. How far is it true? Now, how are the government going to handle the increasing cases, as just Ambassador Kanta just mentioned, that the kind of numbers that is increasing is extremely disturbing. Now, are those numbers, or are these increasing cases going to actually, are the protests going to further due to these cases, and how the government is going to handle these cases, this kind of outburst of COVID cases also. Now, finally, do these protests also indicate that the people have actually come together spontaneously as a reaction to their sufferings in the recent years, to express their desire for a change? What kind of change will that be, keeping in view the socio-political history of China? So these are the few questions that I'm starting with, that come to my mind. I hope some of these questions will be answered today. Now I invite Dr. Rityusha to present her paper.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to be reading the political discontent of these protests. Hopefully, some of the questions that the Chair has raised may be answered during what we proceed to discuss in my presentation. We all know that as resentment over Xi's zero COVID policy has grown nearly 3 years into the pandemic, a wave of civil disobedience and public protests in mainland China have broken out. And we saw in late November and early December this year how these protests have been read against the backdrop of China's tight COVID restrictions. The COVID restrictions basically led to a flare of these protests, which extended to numerous cities, as was pointed out in the introduction, with hundreds of protesters entering into violent altercations with the police. And these protests have been read as President Xi Jinping's toughest test after securing a historical third term in office, as these protesters had been voicing their discontent over pandemic management and continued cycles of lockdown. We've seen how top health officials have admitted publicly the impact of policy, even though they defended it. They proceeded to promise to minimize discomfort to the public by lifting lockdowns as early as feasible after the outbreak of protests. Subsequently, we also saw the zero COVID policy imposed restrictions starting to ease out. However, these may not still simmer down the angst of demonstrators or protesters who took to the streets of numerous cities and colleges, campuses to call for an end to nation's expensive lockdowns. I think the variety of complaints that emerged during these protests, where some even called for the ouster of Chinese leader Xi Jinping, in general protesting against mass testing, lockdowns, mandatory quarantines, digital tracking, all of these point towards a deeper malice. Even though the context of these new protests is specific to the pandemic, the widespread nature and political slogans that accompanied the protests hint at a more considerable discontent against the regime. And although protests in China are not uncommon, as again has been pointed out in the introduction, and we've seen over the last decades how China's middle class rarely participated in political activism, I think this new show of this dissent is very significant. So in terms of, first, I try to look at these protests in terms of their intensity. Over the years, the intensity of public protests has dwindled as the party has tightened control. Yet, according to the Chinese government data, widespread protests in China have been more regular and extensive since the 1990s. The annual count of domestic mass incidents, as they characterize it, or public order disturbances, which include organized crimes as well as street protests, these increased from 5,000 to 10,000 in the early 90s. To 60,000 to 1 lakh in the early 2000s. So despite the absence of official statistics after 2006, research by non-governmental organizations, including the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and also verbal declarations by Chinese officials, placed the number of annual protests after 2006 in to the tune of tens of thousands. If we refer to Chinese scholars who are looking at these incidents, including Professor Sunili Ping, they have put the estimate of these incidents as anywhere between 180,000 onwards since 2010. So mass incidents, which have been defined broadly as planned or impromptu gathering because of certain internal contradictions, which include public speeches or demonstrations or even clashes. These are the kind of incidents that we are looking at when we are looking at the intensity of protests that have emerged. Second question, of course, after the intensity is nature. What is the nature of these protests? Now, despite restrictions on freedom of association, particularly in the decades since the death of Mao in 1976, there have been incidents of protest and dissent in China. Among the most notable, of course, have been the 1959 Tibetan uprising against Chinese Communist Party, 1989 Tiananmen Square protest, which were put down with, of course, a brutal military force, the 1999 demonstration by Falun Gong practitioners, and of course, now we see 2022 protests during the COVID-19 lockdown. All of these protests, I mean, if one were to kind of look at the trajectory in terms of what has been the nature of these protests, we can come to that kind of a conclusion that protesters and dissidents in China have been espousing a variety of grievances. Sometimes these grievances have included corruption as a main, focus. Sometimes it's forced eviction. Sometimes it's around labor issues like unpaid wages. Sometimes very, very political, discourse on human rights abuses. Also environmental degradation, ethnic protests. So name what you may. There've been a variety of, demands around which these protests have been centered. And if we combine all of that together, of course, they point out towards the internal contradictions that have been read as, points of political concern by the party from time to time. And most of the protests that have taken place annually since the Tiananmen Square have been very localized, and they have centered around one of the material concerns, as we raised earlier. The issues ranged from, say, unfair compensation for land purchases, to low industrial wages, to the environmental damage that incurred because of the kind of development strategies chosen, the layoffs in state-owned enterprises, to also the demands of legal recognition to, say, the spiritual sect Falun Gong. So from 1989, this is the kind of, nature of protest that we have seen. However, none of these demonstrations had so far criticized China's top political figures or even the nature of its political system. Instead, these kept focusing on concerns that directly touched the group in center of these protests. In contrast, if we read the protest by the intellectual writer Liu Xiaobao, who wrote Charter 08, advocating for liberal democratic political reform and manifesting political dissent against the system. So that's the kind of comparison that we see for the first time in terms of protest against the system per se. Large-scale protests in Hong Kong in the last 10 years, of course, also signify political discontent against the regime, even though the demands that were emerged during all of these protests in Hong Kong in the last 10 years, they have been pertaining to political reform in Hong Kong and not all over China. But still, the discontent against the regime is writ large in all of these protests. Now, while the parallels have been drawn in certain contexts in terms of the protests now with the infamous Tiananmen Square incident, I feel that they may have been too hasty. Yet the sharp anti-system nature of 2022 anti-lockdown protests and political demands cannot be ignored. There have been sloganeering and there have been calls for Xi and CCP to step down. And of course, political discontent is again writ large on those blank white papers in the hand of protesters, as was pointed out by the chair as well. The counterproductive politics of COVID policies has brought to the fore more profound political discontent against economic slowdown, against state surveillance, against state censorship, and in general, the unfreedoms that kind of surround the notion of very limited citizenship for the Chinese at the moment. Of course, the protests have not reached to the level of 1989 Tiananmen Square protests, but the uprisings present something that has not happened since Xi took power in 2013. And under Xi Jinping, it has been first nationwide protest movement. Nearly all Chinese people, at least Chinese people in large cities, have been subjected to a kind of the similar kind of surveillance and control on their mobility over the past 3 years. And so that's the kind of, unified impact of the COVID lockdown policies has been. Despite the increase in protests, some scholars have argued that these protests may not really pose an existential threat to CCP rule because there is no, connective tissue which keeps binding them and gives them that overall, strength to continue as a rallying force. The preponderance of protests in China has been usually aimed at local level officials, and only a select.
You have 2 more minutes now.
Yes. And only a select few dissident movements have ever sought a systemic change. So whether now this 2022 protest moment should be read as that kind of movement which seeks systemic change. I feel that the majority of protests, if we look at the historicity in the last 20 years, 30 years, the majority of protests which were not that controversial, did not receive any adverse police action or political action. So in terms of the questions raised by the chair as to what could be the further response of Chinese officials, I mean, of course, one is a rectificatory response in terms of easing the COVID restriction. Do we fear any kind of, response in terms of going after the protesters, as it were? Adverse police action or any kind of further taking up of the case of the protesters. I don't see that happening because that would mean that there is a possibility of a further flare-up. And I don't see a larger political action against the political protesters of this particular, in this particular incident. I think that probably the government at the center is going to use these protests as, again, indicators of, testing the local officials' response to the citizens of which they are in charge, the citizens group of which they are in charge. So I don't see over I don't see any expansion of political action against the protesters at this moment. I'll stop here, and probably more questions will come in the question answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Rityusha. It was extremely, you brought it all together. And let's hope to hear from our next speaker, Dr. Bhim Subba.
Thank you, Dr. Usha and the chair and other co-panelists also. And I thank ICS here for actually bringing this panel together and suggesting us that we should speak on this very important event that is unfolding in China. My talk today would pertain to what I'm going to see of China's domestic governance, especially focusing on the governance part and the parties, how party per se is pursuing its idea of governance in China, and definitely what are the sites of protest, why are they important, and also to focus on why such protests have been, or so to say, protests in these provinces, why have they become so important today to understand and to really to see whether these protests are spontaneous protests or are the whole Chinese population or people or Chinese citizens talking about this protest today. So, firstly, I think, as I said, I would be speaking on these three aspects. So that is, one is with regard to governance. So what is China's idea of governance today I'm talking about? So is China focusing on the governance of the party per se, or focusing its main agenda as governance of the state itself, or the art of ruling itself? So how do we see it today? Although China has, the party in fact, has been quite successful in reining its corrupt officials, or trying to reining in the party as being very transparent, very accountable, very virtuous governance. What we say is Sun Tzu with Ren. So has that really led to such kind of manifestations to the art of ruling itself, like the welfare of the people today, if we talk about? Has that been really translated into it? So China's focus on the party as ruling itself as an efficient organization has not really, I would really look into and argue saying that it has not really manifested itself into the art of governing the state today. It is still improving and trying to innovate. Therefore, the concept of innovation in China is always been one of the most important aspects until today, and will likely continue to be further, continue to go further. Second is with regard to the sites of protest today in China. Although the Urumqi fire, accident was one of the immediate regions for protests, but has that led to being spontaneous protest around the country? Yes, at one side, one we see. But however, if you really trying to see, is that rather than being just a failure of a certain administration at the local level, it also shows how the Chinese citizens, Xinjiang citizens and the Han majority citizens think themselves as possible victims of protest. So they're siding or showing empathy as protesters or protesting against Urumqi fire. I would look at from a perspective of how these communities were looking against, looking for, in fact, for this, the plight of Urumqi residents, for so to say. If we go further or go before that, if we see that the so-called vocational education campaigns in Xinjiang, they were never aware about it. Although even if they were about it, they never protested against showing that solidarity with the Xinjiang protest. So now today they see the fire accident as one of the so-called the failure of the state or failure of the party or the administration to really see that, okay, this has really led to, or in fact showing empathy, more than empathy, it would also reflect its own plight, how the administration could deal with it. So I could see that with the sites of protest become so important here. And also, like universities being spaces of protest here. So how are these elite universities, students mostly, although we talk about middle class, as the earlier speaker, Dr. Rityusha, has already alluded to this, but we see substantial presence of this spontaneous, so-called spontaneous student protest in elite universities. Why are these spaces of sites of protest per se today, not a spontaneous protest anywhere around, but mostly in so-called, even in Nanjing University, you could see in Yunnan University, you can see in Beijing, Shanghai, most of the universities were centers of protest here. So that is one. And thirdly, I would say, like in China, although the state has always talked about, or the party state has always talked about good governance, and that the provinces and the local government have to listen to the central government for now. However, having said that, if you really see is that even the locals today, or the local or the regional government and the provincial government has really nothing much to really have the freedom to do it. So in order to protect themselves, so listening the directives from the center is one thing, but at the same time, implementing them at the local level, we see is far different, ball game here. Because in June, if you see this year, we could see that some guideline issued by the state council, like Chukuchun, like 9 no-nos or 9 prohibitions released by central the state council. But these were the general guidelines in 9 guidelines that was being released by the state council. However, implementing them at the local level, we could see many changes within those directives itself. So none of these so-called prohibitions imposed by the state to the local authorities has to be really, it was imposition of prohibitions against the local state authorities not to be arbitrary. Nevertheless, these actually were tweaked by the local administrations, and the fire incident that happened in Urumqi actually is one of the, offshoot, or in fact, one of these, deviation of what these 9 guidelines were issued by the state council. So therefore, you tend to have a local regional government or the regional administration or the provincial administration have a different say in controlling local protests here. And therefore, you always have the blame game here. The center blaming the states, the provincial leaders blaming the local neighborhood leaders, and as well as the party cadres there. So therefore, the art of blame game is always there, and likewise, the provinces leaders also tend to see that since the king is far away and the mountains are high, so you are not being quite accountable. You cannot be that as accountable as what you are. Now, being the state enforcing too much of control, although the state, the party controls the state or the state, mechanisms or institutions, nevertheless, the provincial or the local leaders have always, been, devising ways and methods or institution mechanisms to bring these, population under, under control. Never to say that since regime stability and survivability trumps every other aspects of Chinese society. So there are some certain parallels drawn with other previous protests and all with regard to political protest and economic issues. But this time we tend to see the protest in China is more social, more social and more societal. That's what I think the topics of societal is so important. So they demanded, or they, readings, when we see that they demanded that the emperor has to go down or step down, not because he was politically incorrect, but in fact, he was socially, he failed to really serve the people here. So therefore, it is more of serving the people here. And even if we look into some of the literature coming out now after the major incident of protests happening there, we tend to see incidences of many Weibo bloggers who were so-called 50 Cent, part of 50 Cent armies. Now, they were the ones also who were actively, shaping, influencing local citizenry in China. Now, they were also one of the who were at the forefront of, conducting such, protests and all. And therefore, they say that. So they are not against the state or the party, but they are against what COVID lockdowns are about. So because the death of 10 people in Urumqi was in fact, the failure of governments and the local lockdown, policies and all. So I tend to see, or in my reading, what I see is that it is more of a governance crisis in China that is the state facing. And definitely with so much of social unrest happening, I see this more of how this COVID-19 has in fact become an equalizer in the Chinese society. And Chinese society is not an exception. I think it can be at the global level also. So my argument would be like it is a serious governance crisis. And definitely blaming the state or blaming the local leaders is one thing, but at the same time, you also have international dimensions. I think Dr. Jebin will later speak about that. So,
2 more minutes.
Yeah, so I'll just wind it up. So my three arguments would be it's with regard to its governance crisis, over centralization of policies. Secondly, it's the sites of protest become so important to understand the nature of protest such, and also the local and the central relationship in the local level and the central level becomes so important today to understand really how dynamics of such protest or social unrest happen in China. Thank you. We can discuss later more. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Beam. Very interesting. You have taken us to the governance angle of the protests. Thank you. And next, I invite Jebin, Dr. Jebin, to present his paper.
Yeah, thank you, Usha. And let me also join my colleagues in thanking the ICS for organizing this event. I think it's timely. And I will sort of cut straight to the chase because my colleagues have already laid out quite a bit of ground and provided their own analysis. I will just very quickly touch on, the zero COVID policy, how China has exited the zero COVID policy. Before I get into the main theme of my presentation, which is about the foreign element in these so-called foreign element of these protests, how China has, or the Chinese Communist Party has used the idea of the foreign to achieve some of its own goals. Also, question of how the rest of the world is actually looking at these protests. So to talk about the first part, I think China, in many senses, these protests follow a typical pattern. The government's response also follows a typical pattern. Even though Urumqi might have been the spark, I think it would be a mistake to assume that these protests in any way indicate any solidarity with the oppressed Uyghur people in China. That's not the objective of these protests. So even though there is a major issue that the rest of the world thinks is going on in Xinjiang, the Chinese themselves are somewhat less concerned about this than everybody else. Second, China's exiting zero COVID has been a very chaotic process. You have cases of prices rising, medicines and vaccines and even simple cough syrup or fever medicine completely unavailable, or pharmacists or pharmacies holding people to ransom in a sense, saying, you got to buy other stuff as well if I have to give you this. Plus, of course, let's not forget, even though China reports no COVID deaths yet. I think foreign agencies in China have reported that the COVID toll is mounting. Funeral homes in China, in Beijing at least, seem to be operating around the clock. So while we might, not have situations like we saw in India of bodies buried openly or by the banks of rivers, there is clearly a lot that is going on inside China, of which very little is being reported. So in many ways, we have both an efficient state, which has managed to sort of control protests and keep protests in check, but also the typical inefficiencies of an authoritarian state also in play. Now, let me come to the so-called foreign hand, quote unquote. There are three elements of this that I sort of want to talk about. One is, how is this all being, how does this impact the outside world? Second, how have we observed, how have those of us from outside observed these protests? What do our remarks or analysis or the reportage tell us about ourselves in a way? And third, how does the CPC use the foreign to its own ends? So in terms of the impact abroad, of course, apparently the lack or the shortage of medicines or test kits, etc., have had an impact on foreign markets as well. Chinese demand for these are extending to outside markets. And the point that the director made just before we started this conversation about maybe it's time for India's vaccine Maitri to also make its presence felt. I mean, I think that's a serious point. Even though we have these issues on the border at the LAC with the Chinese, but this is exactly how we can also make our point that despite whatever it's our own inefficiencies in handling COVID, we are today at a very, very different place than the Chinese are. And it is important to show up that the so-called Chinese efficiency that many Indians seem to envy and talk up a great deal is all basically a house of cards. Second, the impact of these protests and China's exiting of zero COVID and the chaos that surrounds it has also led to a kind of a nationalism among Chinese citizens abroad. So I think we have cases of Chinese threatening Chinese abroad for taking positions that are seen as pro-democracy or anti the Communist Party and so on. So in a sense, on the one hand, we talk about China's extraterritoriality, but this territoriality actually goes beyond just the government, but also extends to Chinese citizens abroad. The second part, which is about observing these protests from abroad, I think in India, we saw this case of how coup rumors in China, rumors of coup in China some months ago, sort of spread around massively. There's a great deal of interest. This time around, with the protests, there's considerably less frenzy, but I think there's also less talk about these somehow encouraging or promoting democracy. I mean, clearly, as in the case of Tiananmen, students, when they talk about democracy in China, do not necessarily understand what this is. And often they would balk at democracy if it also meant chaos and upheaval constantly at all times in China. So in a way, the same young people that were caught chanting down with Xi Jinping or down with the Communist Party of China could also be the same young people who would also criticize or hyperventilate against India for whatever goes on the LAC. So in many ways, this indicates that the state remains strong. And one of the things that has happened in the wake of the protests is that many of the protesters have been tracked down. Many of them have been detained. Many of them have been summoned to the police stations for warnings and so on and so forth. So this also needs to be understood for those of us watching or expecting things to change rapidly or suddenly in China. The final part, which is the question about how the Communist Party of China uses the foreign, what it learns from the foreign element, what it sells to foreign audiences, and how it uses the foreign element for the case, for purposes of its domestic politics. Well, in terms of learnings, China, I mean, this process of opening up, exiting COVID has actually been underway for several months. So it's a mistake to consider this as a response directly to the protests. And as part of this, I'm sure the Chinese have been looking at examples around the world, but they certainly did reach out to Hong Kong to see how Hong Kong was dealing with COVID and how Hong Kong was opening up. But also, if you look at what they have not learned, I mean, if they were paying attention to India, they would have known that shortages would happen, there would be chaos, there would be a rapid rise in number of deaths, etc. But clearly, at least for the moment, we can't say that this learning has happened. And also, the Chinese government is, even though foreign vaccines are not allowed, have not been sort of openly allowed, foreign vaccines are now, some of these pills are actually available online. And China has conducted surveys of populations that are most vulnerable to COVID and so on. And I think when you're talking of surveillance, one of the things that we have to remember, I mean, since we started off with Urumqi, as well as these protests, that most of these surveillance tools, let's not forget, are foreign in origin. The Chinese have gotten a great deal of these technology from willing Western companies who have sold this, and which the Chinese have then reshaped and remodeled to their own use for massive or mass surveillance, including facial surveillance of ethnic minorities, and now going after protesters through facial surveillance, as well as, of course, identifying and surveilling populations susceptible to COVID. In terms of what the Chinese government is trying to sell to the outside world, I think even though, I think right from the beginning, there has been an effort to, there's been an understanding that COVID might not necessarily go away so easily. So even though the Chinese government said zero COVID at all times, eventually this became dynamic zero COVID. And then there have been multiple iterations or changes in what dynamic also means. So in a sense, what the Chinese government has constantly been sort of aware of is to ensure that things don't go down south so badly that the rest of the world sees noticeably that China is failing. So for the Chinese government, the Chinese model needs to be prepared to be preserved. There needs to be an impression of dynamism and responsiveness. And I think in this sense, also the point that Beam raised about the location of these protests, elite universities being available for these protests, I think is also part of this image exercise where obviously all of these will be the ones most prominently in the news, but that does not mean the Chinese government is actually losing control over these elite spaces. But because they're elite spaces, they have a certain degree of leeway, which allows students to protest. But one shouldn't expect that these can actually be extended or be taken further. The Chinese government has encouraged its celebrities and influencers to now start talking about their COVID experiences, and these are stories now that are available in the foreign media as well. Of course, sorry, I have one more point, which is about the foreign hand, in terms of how the Chinese are selling. I mean, the case of the Chinese ambassador to France, Liu Xiaoye, who is one of the prominent wolf warriors, he's talked about how outside forces have been using this opportunity to politicize what's going on in China. And apparently he has a very good sense of smell, because he apparently can smell the color revolution that the foreigners are trying to encourage in China. The funny thing is that when he was asked what kind of vaccine he got, he clearly got he said Pfizer, which is clearly a foreign vaccine. So he himself hasn't exactly taken a Chinese vaccine. So let me end. 2 more minutes, Jabin. Yeah, I'm done. So I just want to end by saying that for the Chinese Communist Party, I think it remains very much in control. It remains very much in control of the narrative. It would take a lot to upset that narrative or to shake Chinese control over its citizens. The fact that 2 years of COVID, 2 years of heavy zero COVID has gone on, also explains why many of the streets are empty, because I think, and this is not just COVID, but also something that has been continuing from SARS onwards, that the Chinese people or populations in China are sort of well-trained or sort of socialized into responding very quickly to government orders and to cases like this. So often it is, each of them is for himself or herself. And because they have sort of internalized the fact that the government is not going to be helping them, they might protest a bit, but they're pretty much looking out for themselves. And which is also why one shouldn't expect these protests to develop in scale, because the government controls channels of information, and the government also has other stories to sell, as it were, to the Chinese people. So we have, for example, the incident on the border with India. We have Xi Jinping's foreign visit. So all of these are also used as distractions. How long and how much of a distraction they will be, we still need to wait and watch. Thank you.
Thank you, Jabin. Extremely interesting. You brought the foreign element into the protests, and it's of course you just made us rethink about this whole idea behind the protest, and it's not just because of the Urumqi fire. So even though they are saying that it could be a trigger, but effectively, I don't know, as I understand that you are trying to say that the authoritarian rule can be inefficient. Obviously, it is the inefficiency of the authoritarian rule, but because of the authoritarian nature of the rule, which is perhaps, are you trying to indicate that the COVID, since you said that the government knows that the COVID is not going away, but by bringing in the zero COVID policy, did they actually try to perhaps increase the surveillance so that in any future protests, do they seem to be a much more confident authoritarian government at present? And to Beam, I think, and thank you. It was very interesting how you, I mean, the fact that you trying to, link somewhere that the Hans are trying to connect out, it's kind of a binding factor in their, because of the protest. I mean, that's why they came out. And I don't know, I mean, whether it's a binding factor or whether it's empathy or more of an empathy, like we could have been in this situation. And therefore the protests as and I agree with you when you say that it's more social and societal, and it does not have a purely political nature. But yes, as we all know, that social and political is not like, they do not exist separately. They are so intertwined. But so you are, I mean, it's interesting that you're trying to say that basically it is it is the social dissatisfaction of the people which has led to this protest, and therefore it might not it might not continue. But what is interesting was that you were trying to bring out the fact that it is also the increasingly the change in policies. Do you want to say that the change in policy is also taking somewhere to the lessening of accountability? Does that, I mean, like nobody's accountable in the end of the day. Everybody is, like, as you said, the blame game. So is it also directed towards that? But if you're talking about accountability in this case, when there's a protest or when there's a problem, then what about the accountability of getting the work done? So are they connected? And Rityusha, I think it was the way you just actually brought out the whole nature of the protests, and trying to point out that the protests are happening in the past few years increasingly, as you said, that after 1991 it has increased. So are we trying to say that, like any other country, there are protests in China? And as you indicated, that there's dissatisfaction among the people and the government. dissatisfaction among the people. However, does it also indicate that people are getting more and more aware, and they're deciding to express themselves amidst restrictions and more and more restrictions? Yeah, and generally to all presenters, maybe I have a question that what is the political economy of this protest? Maybe you can start by answering these questions, and we can open the floor for questions after that.
There's also a raised hand from
Okay, yes. Welcome, ma'am. Yeah.
Yeah, except that there are also two questions prior to my raising my hand in the chat box. So I think, Usha,
okay,
right, let the three respond to the issues you've raised, and then we'll open up the whole thing.
Okay. Jabin, you can start. Maybe.
Okay. All right. So I think, so Usha, to your first question, has the Chinese government used zero COVID for improving authoritarian efficiency? I think that's the gist of the question. I would say yes. Clearly, zero COVID was very convenient for a system, a political system like the Communist Party of China's, and it worked. It came well in hand for Xi Jinping in the run-up to the 20th Party Congress. But I think, kind of like how China's one-child policy has turned out, the price that China might pay might be much larger than anticipated. In terms of the political economy of these protests, I think it's interesting that when the Chinese ambassador to France, that I just mentioned, Lu Xiaoye, he, when he was asked this question about, I think, about the Chinese mRNA vaccine, he said that yes, China has an mRNA vaccine, but what he followed up immediately was by saying that it has been certified by Indonesia on the eve of the G20 summit. So clearly, and then he said that, of course, the Chinese vaccine came much later than Pfizer and Moderna, and therefore we do not have a chance to capture the international market. So clearly there's an economic element to it. There's also a political signaling or a political prestige element to this. So, I think both elements always go hand in hand. The politics and the economics of it always go hand in hand for a party like the Communist Party of China.
Beam?
Oh, yeah. Thank you, Chair, for your questions on with regard to why is it just political or in fact societal. But definitely what I meant to say was that although it is societal, but definitely the politics appears in it, because as the parties, as a single party rule state that China is today, so the legitimacy that the Communist Party has in the state today is because it has to serve the people. Now, serving the people, that I think is the question that Nishant Sharma has also posed. I think I want to respond it together. The performative legitimacy of the party is here in question. Although now we are talking performative legitimacy of the party, definitely one is one thing, but also of the local leaders. Now, if a local leader performs better, he is likely to be promoted. Now, the social contract is of the people with the party, not with the local leader here. So if you are saying that down, Xi Jinping has, stepped down, in fact, it is against the party per se, not against him per se. So that is what we, I think, understand by that. Yeah, with regard to, and one of the important, issue is that China definitely faces, it's too much focus on the party governance or internal governance has really took away the sheen of governing the state here. Now, governing the party and governing the state are two different things, if you have to really understand. So therefore, China's focus, or the party is focused too much on anti-corruption campaign, this Pashang thing, and this 4 moods of decadence. These are all cleansing the party. Although today it has really taken care of other official non-party members also, nevertheless, still it focuses on the party. So, and as Jebin said, the political economy. Now that, vaccine, mRNA vaccine, approved by Indonesia, but tested in Latin American country. Now, you could see how it's not being tested within China itself. So how do you see really? Definitely the lack of, these vaccines are coming. And at the same time is also the so-called nationalism that we have seen in China in the recent past, China becoming increasingly powerful, aggressive, also has led to increased nationalism within itself. It can be economic policies, autarkic, policies such as being self-reliant, self-sufficient. Therefore, I think that for me is a situation that really China should really overcome in futures to come. I think that is my take on certain queries. Yeah. Thank you.
Rityusha, I think.
Yeah. So in response to your first question, are people more aware? Yes, definitely. And we've seen how over the years, protesters or those who wanted to voice their opposition to certain policies with regards to a particular issue, they would use very novel ways of protesting. So, and all of these novel ways would actually emanate from the fact that the political awareness has, increased in some sense. So, for instance, the images from Qatar coming in of, people participating at large in the World Cup, ongoing World Cup, and protesters saying things on online sites as questioning whether Qatar is from another planet, where people can move about freely, etc. So I mean, all of those, the idea that they associate all of these things that they see in the news, in the media, with a certain kind of political point of view means that there is political awareness at large. In response to your second question, what is the political economy of the protests? The protests have, of course, represented the unprecedented economic challenge that China sees today. And of course, it has economical and market implications. In November itself, like in around 29th, 30th November, when protests the news about protests came up, the oil prices plunged, and the share of companies that rely on China for production also felt the heat in that sense. For instance, if you look at the share of Apple, it fell by 2.6%, following the reports that unrest at one of its factories could result in almost millions of a few million less iPhone Pros this year. So that kind of impact of these protests was, of course, felt. And we've seen that cities have remained closed whenever outbreaks have gotten bad enough. Shanghai being closed for 2 months, Chengdu being closed during the entire fall season. All of this, of course, meant that not just the central government, but of course the local government also felt the heat of these protests in terms of economic downturn. And from people's point of view, of course, there have been reports coming that they have struggled to find food and other necessities during these lockdowns. So on the one hand, of course, the economic growth has slumped. From people's point of view, unemployment has been rising. And it has, of course, the entire, situation has led to a major global production constraint. And of course, the way we have seen inflation happening in China. Global supply chain pressures have also increased. If you compare how global supply chains were during October, and then you kind of see it during November, the end of November and early December, of course, the pressure is seen as moderately increasing in the consecutive, weeks. And one such indicator could be reading the Federal Reserve Bank of New York's Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. So, that's the kind of parameter that we see. the impact on commodities, etc., oil prices. I mean, all of this is the combined idea that we can, get from the impact of protest on political economy. I'll address the question by one of the speakers when you give me a go-ahead, one of the audiences.
Do you want me to read the question?
No, I have read it. If everybody is comfortable, then I can respond to it, if the chair permits.
Yes, please do.
So I think the question by Narendra is with regards to what are the possibilities of the Chinese citizens protesting their right to assemble peacefully, etc., and how these are curbed by the government. According to the 1940. According to the Constitution of China, there are two particular articles, Article 13 and Article 35. 13 is basically talking about people having the freedom of assembly and association, and 35 is talking about, procession, association, demonstration. So these words are mentioned there. The Chinese government, of course, also has domestic and international obligations to permit protest and to protect the rights of demonstrators, being a part of, larger, this whole idea of international organizations and being a part of United Nations declaration framework, even though they have not ratified it. In practice, of course, these rights are tightly circumscribed, and generally under the notion of maintaining social stability, the guarantee of freedoms is, of course, curbed. And the Constitution also mentions that it is the duty of Chinese citizens to fight against those forces or elements that are hostile to China's socialist system and the forces that try to undermine it. So, and if we look at the anti-subversion laws, for instance, Article 105 of the Criminal Code in China, all of these are basically are used to criminally prosecute the individuals who may be exercising, the rights under Article 13 and 35. So that's the kind of a thing. Chinese dissidents, protesters, they have employed numerous tactics. They've changed their way of protest to express dissatisfaction with authorities, and they have used various ways and methods of protesting. For instance, sometimes writing a manifesto or organizing a boycott or marches. There have been violent protests as well. So all of these from time to time have shown the way Chinese people have used alternative forms of protests, and they have also, used semi-institutionalized methods of protest in terms of, assembling together and adopting more public forms of resistance, like sitting in or picketing or coordinating hunger strikes, etc. So, and in response, of course, the Chinese authorities have also come up with, they have moderated or they have modulated the way they would curb these protests. For instance, if we look at late 1990s, Shanghai Public Security Bureau put in a slew of new measures, new policies to combat the increase in the number of, protests and the size of mass incidents, so that the size could be contained. And these policies by the Shanghai Public Security Bureau acted as, a kind of, a template to for the government in terms of suggesting how the government could be proactive in assessing or preempting the local social economic protests that may be emanating from a variety of reasons. So I don't know if I've answered your question. Yeah.
So Professor Alka Acharya, I think now you can come out. You can ask your question.
All right. I think Nishant had asked his question earlier. Shall we have that first? Because I raised my hand after Nishant, so I'm ready to.
Rityusha just answered his question.
All right. It was to Bhim.
Okay. Yeah, Bhim.
Yeah, I tried to answer in the previous question.
Yeah, you did. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. All right. Then I'll come up with. So thank you all very much. Very interesting presentations, and I like the neat division of labor that you three did in terms of the political, the governance issue, and the foreign hand. And yet, as I listened to all three of you, it seemed that there was a very deep connection that was integrating the arguments that each of you made. And whether we talk in terms of rising political dissatisfaction or failure of governance, or the Chinese being on the back foot vis-a-vis this whole way in which COVID has unfolded. And they were on the back foot right from the beginning, when it was a China virus and how China had spread it all over the world. So they're no strangers to this, this backlash from foreign countries about the fact that they are responsible for this virus. Now, I just have two questions here. One is that when you bring in the governance issue, for 2 years, the Chinese policy was seen as a great success. Visitors who were locked down there, or when it briefly opened, they managed to go there. Chinese people themselves, there were, of course, dissatisfaction also about the discomfort caused due to the lockdown. And yet there were sufficient praises for the efficiency with which they organized distribution of food, medicines, organized the whole lockdown system very efficiently. And though there was a fairly striking difference between how the urban areas were organized and controlled and managed, and some of the more far-flung areas, the fact is that the Chinese managed to come out over the course of the first 2 years, despite protests, despite regular kind of dissatisfaction expressed, and they managed to come out pretty well. And remember, that was a time when globally everybody was going through similar things. Everybody was suffering lockdowns. Everybody was having problems in terms of economic hardships all over the world. So China was another one of them, but zero COVID, very successful. And the reason for their continuing with zero COVID was that they could not afford deaths or casualties due to this COVID, which, given their large numbers, would have completely undermined their entire management of this. Now, why is it that we see these protesters coming out now? And clearly, it seems to me that if there was a failure of governance has been happening throughout. It's not as if clockwork, they were handling the whole thing. So failure of governance in Urumqi, leading to a kind of cascading of protests across these urban spaces, these elite spaces. Why? So I'm questioning the particular timing, given that governance has been uneven, but on the whole, fairly well managed. Linked to this is the question that the chickens have come home to roost as far as the vaccine is concerned. And it's obvious that they are looking at a failure of their homegrown vaccine. How are they going to deal with this? Because they have not been able to vaccinate everybody. The senior citizens have been kept out of it. I was reading somewhere that initially the vaccines were restricted to a certain age group, which led to an apprehension that maybe this was bad for the senior citizens. So they sort of refused to take it. So they've not been able to vaccinate. They've not been able to reach that herd immunity. And zero COVID seems still the most sensible way to keep deaths down, because we are cells. And finally, let's not overdo this paranoia about the foreign hand or the opposition that we see vis-a-vis the projection in the international media. I mean, when we were going through our own very horrible Delta wave, reports of the kind of things that were happening here were very violently protested even in our own country, that foreign interests inimical to India, in tandem with domestic interests, were projecting India as a basket case. So I think somewhere at the bottom of it all, I still would zoom into the governance issue. And my question is, why does it fail? Why does its failure lead to this protest now at this level when it becomes a major issue? All right, I stop there.
So is your question to all the speakers?
Yes.
I think, Beam, you can...
Anyone can answer, actually. It's not, anyone can just address it.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Alka. And I think I will take the governance issue in the domestic sphere, and later Dr. J.V. and Rityusha can also join. But yeah, definitely what I meant is why now? Why, despite 2 years of, COVID pandemic, why Urumqi incident has become a trigger, so to say, as a poster, poster for the protest today. I think it is what I read from the existing, sources, and what I deduce is that the timing. Firstly, why governance? Urumqi is one of the most well fortified provinces of China. Best governance. Anybody who is party secretary of party secretary of Urumqi has a likely place in the Politburo. So why Urumqi? Therefore, it is one of the most so-called efficient, governed, and highly guarded province of China. So even if those provinces, being one of the most efficient ones guarded, even if those provinces have such issues, so definitely other provinces is can be as although, because the administration in other provinces in coastal regions in eastern China has different administrative mechanisms, unlike what is happening in China. So that is one thing. Most efficient guarded provinces is not as functioning as one. And if we really look at the failure, yes, definitely, because the way the party today has turned itself not just as a revolutionary party. Now, the debate also comes from how the party has changed its own narrative and its own goal as party seeking to govern the state. So, how is this governing party really shaped governance? And since Xi Jinping came to power in 2013, 12, and 13, governance has become the mantra of Xi Jinping's rule in China. So, if it falters in the very idea that it has, so it really, and although like the protest and this, misgovernance of China is not unread and unheard of, but whereas the party under Xi Jinping has become increasingly very powerful, all comprehensive party, at the same time having such issues with mismanagement, I would say, or misgovernance between the center and the provincial leaders, leading to such incidences in Urumqi, and likely its effect to other provinces of China, and especially in elite protest sites, actually shows it is the governance still is the most important than just political. I would say governance in real administrative and societal sense. I would say that. I will rest here.
Thanks.
Jabin.
Okay, so I think if anyone's overdoing paranoia, it's the Communist Party of China itself. But I think I agree with Professor Acharya on the comparison between India and China. I think that's an apt comparison, and I think it should give everyone pause that such comparisons are even being made, and because they are appropriate comparisons. Beam mentioned that governance has become a mantra in China. I mean, good governance is also a mantra here. So anything that sort of goes against this narrative becomes problematic immediately. And I think it shows, it just highlights the fact that India and China, there's a lot to be studied, there's a lot to be compared. And even though they have two different political systems, there are still areas where matters overlap. And there is a great deal of learning that is possible. not only about what we should be doing, but also what we should not be doing. I think this is a point that needs to be said again and again as a way of reminding Indians that we can do better. So I suppose that's my only answer. Only response there. And if anything, more than paranoia on the Indian side, there's this. One would expect the rest of the world to be sort of thinking, "Aha! Finally, it is China's turn to suffer." But I suppose this sense of Schadenfreude, which is something that I don't think Indians will have, because we've suffered very, very badly through the second wave, and I don't think it's a fate that we would wish upon anyone, including our worst enemies. So yeah, let me stop there.
Jabin, you can also answer Ambassador Kant's question.
Okay. All right. So Ambassador Kanta has asked whether to what extent the protests were responsible for jettisoning the zero COVID policy.
It seems to me that the address to Rityusha is actually what you had said. So maybe there's a slight mismatch, because he's raised the question about Ambassador Liu Xiaoye and put Rityusha's name there, though I think you actually had mentioned. So maybe Ambassador Kant can clarify. I think the first question seems more directed to Rityusha, the framing of the question.
It's okay. Let Jabin answer that.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
But
So
would you like Rityusha to answer the foreign hand theory?
Yeah, why not? She can give her perspective on that.
All right.
I'll sort of try and answer as much as I can, and of course Rityusha can come in. So I think even before the protest, I think it has been very clear to most analysts that the zero COVID policy was on its way out, and we expected, I think most of us expected it to be well and truly out by the time the Yanghui or the two sessions came around in March of next year. And as I think Ambassador Kanta pointed out, these regulations that came out on 11th November, these 20 measures to optimize management of COVID, etc. So this was already out there. So it was just a matter of time. But I think what is interesting is how these protests forced the government to quicken the pace of this. And I think that speaks to a fair amount of confusion, fair amount of uncertainty about exactly what to do, because this zero COVID policy is not just connected to surveillance and political control, but it's also now become implicated in the nature and the trajectory of the Chinese economy, how the Chinese economy will deal with things such as the supply chain blocks that the Americans have placed on China. So there's a whole bunch of things that are now going to come to a head once zero COVID comes out. It's not just political issues, but also economic issues. And I think that's where the crux of it. And if I might just continue on to Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay's question, which is, was there a faction that was arguing for relaxation of COVID before the Congress and did the protest? I mean, this is all speculation, but I think the fact that Li Shi was brought in as, was it Li Chang? Sorry, was brought in as, now I'm confused between the two Lees, but, as premier from Shanghai, I think you also have to look at his record. He has been one of those advocating for the use of foreign vaccines, for opening up and a measured opening up of, in a zero COVID situation, except until when things really hit the fan, he had to follow the central directive. So I think there has always been a discussion about this. I wouldn't put it quite as a political factional issue, but the fact that there are different points of view within the Communist Party, and they are trying to find out which is the most appropriate way to, which appropriate method to adopt. I mean, the question about Ambassador, or whether that narrative is there on social and official media, I think both Rityusha and Beam can answer. Thank you.
So, Chair, with your permission, may I?
Please do.
Yeah, so the first question is actually, I'll refer to Ambassador Kant's question regarding the foreign hand. even though the narrative has been set in place regarding, the foreign hand being behind the protests, I think the way it has impacted the public opinion has been very limited. And if we look at the way public has responded on various news sites, social media sites, many of the viral videos actually have shown that demonstrators are actually ridiculing this particular idea that foreign forces are there to blame for the protests, etc. Some of the comments were to the tune of, asking what foreign force actually set the fire in Xinjiang, or how did the bus in Quito get overturned by the foreign forces, etc. So this kind of a social media response has been seen in terms of public opinion. So even though foreign hand has been a theory that has been tried to played up. I mean, the government officials have tried to play up in a very limited sense of the term. I don't think that narrative has caught any kind of, it hasn't caught steam. So I don't think that kind of a thing we'll see, or this particular theory will be played up in terms of a response to the protests. Probably the government authorities will try to let the protest die down in terms of the measures that they would be taking as a response to ease out the hardships experienced by the people at large, and which is where I think, if the chair permits, I would also like to address Professor Mohanty's question in terms of long-term systemic implications. Is it okay?
Yeah, please do.
Yeah, so I feel that the way these protests have panned out and the way we have seen the response by the government, systemic implications would mean that there is a marked difference in terms of either the kind of governance discourse that Bhim was referring to, or any marked significant shift in terms of the political economic policies that the government has been having so far. I do not see a very long-term systemic implication as of now of these protests, except for the fact that probably political action against protesters would be very mellow. And protesters, what they have been demanding in terms of concrete material, grievances, probably those grievances would be met firsthand by the authorities. So systemic implication would be hard to kind of gauge at this particular moment, at this juncture, because I think this is a time for, consolidation of power that she has actually acquired through this particular term, and by an overhaul of the entire government and how he continues to validate this term would be through sustained measures to address the concerns. So any systemic change I do not foresee as of now in terms of in the wake of these protests, except for addressing the grievances, the material grievances. Addressing the political grievances in terms of changes in the system, I don't see them being addressed firsthand. Yeah, thank you.
I think we have Akshat who has raised his hand. You can ask your question.
Good afternoon. My name is Akshat Mani. I'm a research intern at the ICS. My question is to Dr. Jatin. Thank you so much for your comprehensive presentation, sir. It's a pleasure to see you present. So over the last month or so, news, especially Western news media, has talked of the problem of quote-unquote Chinese overseas police stations and in countries across the world. So my question is, would you say that there is or could have been a role played by these so-called Chinese police stations abroad in preventing and or controlling and or stifling overseas Chinese citizens from furthering this domestic dissent beyond Chinese borders and giving it more international attention? Thank you.
Okay, quickly, I think we should not get carried away by this announcement of Chinese police stations. Chinese embassies have also been doing precisely the same role that Akshat has just mentioned, Chinese police stations to be doing for a very long time. They have control over Chinese expatriates. They have Taiwan reunification groups organized of Chinese expats, or sometimes even Chinese diaspora, Chinese students in foreign countries. So all of that has been going on for a very long time. I think the presence of Chinese police stations really depends on the country in question, where legal systems are a bit lax or a bit relaxed, and depends of course also on the number of Chinese citizens or expatriates in many of these places. I think places like Italy, where have very large Chinese populations, immigrants working in and so on, have reported these sort of stations. But yeah, I mean, I think we are still figuring out exactly the extent and the role of these so-called police stations. Thank you.
I think Shubhadeep and followed by him, Ashraf. Both of you can ask your questions.
Should I go first, ma'am? Okay. Thank you, Chair, and the esteemed speaker for putting out such a elaborate discussion on the topic, which is of current. Sorry, I was muted. There are three questions which I have. First is that on the terms of the central democracy that China follows. So if we see the zero COVID policy has come from the top, but when it comes to relaxation, it came from the provinces or the provinces government. So how do you see that way? So does it term that because the sea was facing a strong challenge, so it came from the lower side? So that's my first. Second, in terms of the economy, so the countries that are following strict lockdown, as in case of India, so it took nearly a year. Even we still are struggling to go back to the time pre-COVID in terms of the economy, and China being such a huge supply chain center. So how do you feel that when we can see a China bouncing back to the pre-COVID era? And third question is that recently the conflict that is happening in a border area, and at the same time this sea is facing a strong interest or conflict with its own Chinese people. So these two things happening together, is only a coincidence, or it has a certain bigger picture which we need to see at? Thank you.
Iram, Ashraf, you can also ask your question. Maybe it'll be taken up together.
Ma'am, he has posted his question in the chat box also.
Okay, so maybe all of you can start. Just comment. We just have this will be the last round of questions. Maybe we can.
Yeah, just to correct Shubhadeep, Iram Ashraf is a lady.
Oh, sorry, ma'am.
Iram, ma'am, should I read Iram's question? She's on mute. So Iram's question is regarding the US during COVID lockdowns.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Oh, hi, sorry. Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. First of all, my congratulations on hosting what is a fantastic seminar at the moment. I'm really, really enjoying it. There's so many questions in my mind. So I've basically brought it down to one, which is if you looked at COVID-19 lockdowns in countries such as the United States and, for example, in the UK, we had people like Anthony Fauci and Professor Chris Whitty. They were the front faces for the lockdowns. So basically, they allowed people like President Trump to rant against the lockdowns that, because of this Fauci guy, whatever. Has anybody like that ever been brought forward by the government in that sense? So that would be interesting, because the other thing you would like to know is this hesitancy we find in COVID vaccine uptake that prevailed in countries such as France even, because they had a legacy of the government abusing their power in prior vaccination programs. So I would also be interested, has anybody done a study of this, that something like this happened in China, for example, which kind of explains the hesitancy and also the reluctance of the Communist Party to come down hard on insisting everybody takes up the vaccine. So that's my two questions. Thank you very much.
Maybe Bheem, you can start answering, and maybe quickly all three of you can give your take on it.
Yeah. Thank you, Iram, for your wonderful actually question. And just say, as a person to blame by Xi Jinping, I have no just to uh, answer that. I think although Zhongnanshan, being the famous pulmonologist that China has seen since SARS days onwards, 2003 onwards, actually he has been one of the main advisors of China's, COVID policy also. But he being blamed, I don't think so, because but he and the National Health Commission officials that they are, and many of the doctors who had served directly have been honored as model. They've been invited as model, an honorable guest as party delegates to the 20th Party Congresses. I think there are 4 or 5. I don't recall names, but I can share some details later if you want. Yeah, definitely there are this. And even in Shanghai lockdown and the episode of zero COVID policy, I think Zhongnanshan still actually is an important say in China today. So that I think blaming him, in fact, actually blame is blaming the party itself. So I don't think so. The Xi Jinping regime can really uh, have any scapegoats as Anthony Fauci or Kitty is in America or in United Kingdom. Yeah. And with should I answer some of the questions addressed to me, Dijay?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so Ambassador Kanta has asked me a question. Has it dented Xi Jinping's political, uh, you know, has it dented Xi Jinping's, authority? Uh, I think Xi Jinping has actually, although it has tried to challenge the party's governance legitimacy, and it has tried to, question his authority, but I don't think so that would really reflect in the larger narrative in China, because uh, the local officials have already taken the blame now and has been already the party has already taken steps to saying that even the ambassador yesterday was saying that it was local officials who took it very seriously. They took at one size fit all kind of a strategy to what that happened in Urumqi. So I don't think so that can really, but definitely I think China's vaccine policy or manufacturing policy, that actually that should be the one that can really, if China is able to come out with this mRNA vaccine as soon as possible, that would actually give him more say to say later. Uh, and some question with regard to
Maybe you can answer Rape sir's question also.
yes, has China failed miserably in health front? Um, as if it that China has failed miserably in health front, definitely it has. But that can be also a relative question, like how miserable did he fail? Like given the number of deaths by statistics that they have come out, I think unlike other countries, it has done relatively better in saving people's lives. But today, with regard to vaccination, providing vaccination to senior citizens, elderlies, I think it has really not been so efficient as it is because of vaccine hesitancy. And at the same time, with China's increasing demographic, that old age, senior citizens demography, I think China cannot afford to really force its citizens to really take vaccines, so to say. I think that would be a huge catastrophe. That's my understanding. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Jabin?
Okay. To Subhadeep's questions, I think policy always comes from the top, but China has a long record and history of allowing implementation to, the provinces or the localities to find their own ways to implement. It's never a hard and fast implementation, often in many cases, especially economic policies and so on. And the center itself has learned from whatever lessons have been found at the local level. And I think partly, I think the thrust of your question is also sort of, in a sense, why is it? I mean, it's about a question of assigning blame, and I think Bhim has answered this that, in his presentation, that often the party takes credit, but when it happens, when it's a question of blame, then the localities cop the blame. And this is also very normal. I think it's part of the game that both central and local authorities understand, and which even protesters understand, I think, as Rityusha also pointed out. On the question of China, the Chinese economy bouncing back, I think that's like going to be considerably more harder than letting go of zero COVID. There are some long-term trends in the Chinese economy: falling population, the US-China trade war, a general sense of unease and suspicion of Chinese economic projects all around, which is why the Chinese have now come up with this Global Development Initiative and the Global Security Initiative and so on. So all of that added to, trends like the thumping, lying flat among the youth and so on and so forth. I think all of that will still are all hurdles that the Chinese economy needs to cross before it can, as you say, bounce back. About the conflict on the border, I think, it's tempting to think that there is a connection, and there is at least there is a theory that the Great Leap Forward, Mao's failures in the Great Leap Forward were also what led to the 1962 conflict as a way of distracting criticism and regaining his stature once again in China. So that is always, out there as a theory. But I would say in this particular case, Xi Jinping has been calling for PLA to toughen up, to understand what real combat is, or to engage in something close, to get ready for wars of the future, etc., for a very long time, long before COVID-19. So with or without COVID, we would have seen incidents on the border. It's maybe a matter of convenience that, it can be used by, hyper-nationalist netizens in China and so on. But I don't think it particularly changes. The Chinese people aren't stupid. They are not going to be distracted beyond a point when, the conflict is so far away. Often, I think, in the 2010s, in the early 2000s, when the Japan-China issue was coming up, the protests on the Senkaku and so on were coming up, often Chinese citizens would ask, why are you worried about a piece of real estate so far out in the sea when we are being deprived of our real estate here inside China itself? Chinese government grabbing land for real estate projects and so on and so forth. So there is a way in which the Chinese people will always, get back at the government and question this. So I also want to answer Professor Monti's question about long-term systemic implications of these protests. I think broadly, one implication could be that there have been some bounds set or understood about the limits of tolerance of the Chinese people. And so we are likely to see some kind of relaxation over some time. But this is again a historical process. Whether imperial dynasties or the party, they've always engaged in this tightening control, relaxing control. This Fang Shou dynamic has been constant in Chinese history. And I would suspect that, in a few years' time or in a little while's time, the party will continue or start a new round of these kind of restrictions and constraints on the Chinese people. And the cycle will, restart. Thank you.
I think you should address Aram's question as well, Jabin.
Yeah, sorry. So I think, Bhim talked about Chong Nanshan, and Chong Nanshan is of course well known in China because he was at the forefront of the SARS crisis. But I think one big difference between Chong and Fauci, as Bhim pointed out, is that Chong is constrained by political considerations. He is not able to put forward scientifically rational reasons rationale or reasons for zero COVID in the first place, and now for exiting zero COVID. So now he's calling what is it? He's talking about Xin Quan Kanmao, coronavirus cold, as if it's just a cold that everybody can get over. I think that tells you the limits of read and expert in China. If you need expertise, you need expertise to remain politically neutral or politically unconstrained, so that they can speak truth to power. That isn't happening in China, and that is increasingly difficult in Xi Jinping's China. Yeah.
Rityusha.
Insofar as I mean, it's not really a direct response to any of the questions, but I think it kind of fits in well with the responses on various questions by Jabin and Bheem. I think one point that kind of emerges in all our in all the three speakers' presentation is that and this reflects on the systemic change. It reflects on how the government responds, and also whether there is a need for a voice of China in terms of a COVID response. So it's a kind of a connecting thread. I think the Chinese government's own internal assessments regarding the virus were quite there, and they were quite frank well before the protests started. So this is also in part a response to what Ambassador Kant had raised earlier, whether the protest jettisoned the easing of the lockdown. And at that point in time, the internal assessments were that that at present the local epidemic situation is severe and very complicated, and that the local governments and local leaders should follow the clear-cut requirements which are there, which are outlined by the party central committee in order to prevent epidemic. Now, when the and in response to this kind of a directive from the center, of course, the local governments chose in terms of either opening up or controlling the virus in terms of putting in further restrictions. And of course, that led to what we saw in terms of huge problems, number of protests, etc. Now, after these protests, how have the Chinese leaders responded? They have sent a new message about the virus, and there have been, and these messages basically mark clear and large shifts in terms of making the virus on the one hand sound less frightening, and saying that local governments have been too restrictive, and their prevention activities will be held accountable. And the central government has also changed the target in terms of, focusing more on the elderly in terms of vaccination. So the way the local government have been, the central government has been quick to pass on the buck in terms of putting responsibility. So this is how the, this is the response of the government, and it partly answers all of the questions in one way or the other. Of course, now what happens next is something that remains to be seen. But in terms of how policy direction has shifted course, we have seen what the central leaders in Beijing have been in terms of how they have been handling with the protest. Or do we need a voice of China in that sense during the protest? Not really, because there is a well-established rerouting of responsibility in terms of passing from center to local in that sense. Can we have an independent voice? Not really, as Bheem and Javin have also pointed out, because there are, of course, party affiliations, connections, and holding that position in the party in itself means that there is a sense of collective responsibility. So someone who's in an extremely significant, powerful position within the party, if that person is seen as failing or as being the reason behind something, there is a notion of collective responsibility there as well. So I hope that somehow it's an addition to what other speakers have said. Thank you.
Thank you, Rityusha. I have just been told that we have more time for questions. Is it, Sugandha?
Ma'am, we've extended the time limit. So,
okay, so we can wind up here.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, all the three speakers. I think it was an excellent discussion that we had today. And somehow it's one thing that has been pointed out again and again, and I don't know, it just comes to my mind that the Chinese have been going through this kind of restriction for the past 3 years. So it's not 2 years. It started in the end of 2019 and it started a little bit more ahead of us. And I think, imagining what they might have gone through for the past 3 years is definitely something which is so natural that has come out through the protest. And I think that as the speakers, all three of them also suggested, that it is perhaps just that what. Thank you very much for everyone, the participants, for being here. And thank you, Professor Alkacharya, for giving me this opportunity to chair a session, which I've not done before. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. With this, we would like to wrap the session, and I would like to thank all the panelists for giving their precious time for such a riveting discussion. The video for today's discussion will be available on ICS YouTube platform. We would like to welcome everyone for our next Wednesday seminar on ICS HYI doctoral fellowships. Information related to the same will be available on the ICS website, or you could subscribe to our newsletters for regular updates. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.